Welcome in, everyone. If you are joining us today, you are likely the kind of person who is just always asking questions.
Absolutely. The intensely curious type.
Right. You might be, prepping for a major meeting, trying to catch up on a specific field, or maybe you're just really curious about how the actual machinery of government works.
How the sausage gets made, so to speak.
Exactly. But you also value your time. You want the smartest insights and those real aha moments without having to wade through just a mountain of information overload.
And that is exactly what we do here.
Right, so you are in the right place. Today, we have a custom deep dive tailored just for you. We're looking at a source document that, well, on the surface, it might look a bit dry.
Oh, definitely.
It's the Wikipedia article titled List of United States Senators from Florida.
And look, it is entirely understandable if a table of names, political affiliations, and dates doesn't immediately sound like a thriller to you.
Right, I mean, it's a spreadsheet, basically.
It is. But lists and tables like this are essentially a state's DNA mapped out over time. If you only read the names, you completely miss the story.
Yeah.
However, if you start looking closely at the gaps in the dates, the procedural anomalies, and the footnotes, you suddenly uncover the broader context of what was happening across the entire country.
Okay, let's unpack this. And because our mission today is to turn this bureaucratic ledger into a genuinely fascinating timeline of American history.
I love that. Let's do it.
We're going to uncover the dramatic events hiding right there in the margins, from secession and the complete fracture of the nation to unprecedented legislative gridlock.
Devastating tragedy, too.
Yes, tragedy, and the sweeping political pendulum swings of the modern era. So let's start right at the beginning.
Starting line.
Florida officially becomes a state and is admitted to the Union on March 3, 1845. And right out of the gate, the document shows the state getting its first two senators.
David Levy-Yulee in the Class 1 seat.
Yep. And James Westcott in the Class 3 seat. Both are Democrats, and both officially start their terms in July of 1845.
And for the first decade and a half, the table reflects what is basically standard operating procedure. Elections are held, terms end, new representatives cycle in.
The bureaucratic machinery is functioning exactly as designed.
Right up until it abruptly stops.
Yeah, you hit this highly specific footnote attached to the date, January 21st, 1861.
And that is a huge turning point.
The text tells us that on that specific day, Senators David Levy-Yulee and Stephen Mallory just withdrew from the United States Senate. They announced their departure and walked right out of the chamber.
Which is an incredible visual if you think about it.
What was the atmosphere like? What was the actual administrative consequence of that moment?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the timing tells you everything. January 1861 is the boiling point of the American Republic.
Right, the precipice of the Civil War.
Exactly. The footnote explicitly states that Mallory and Yulee withdrew, alongside several other senators from various states, due to their respective states' decisions to secede from the Union.
So the Senate record is essentially showing us the cold administrative reality of a nation tearing itself apart.
Yes. And administratively, Mallory's seat was officially declared vacant by the Senate a few weeks later, on March 14, 1861.
And Yulee's?
Yulee's seat was technically already vacant because his term happened to expire at noon on March 4th. But the practical result is identical. Both seats just go completely empty.
I want you listening right now to just pause and consider the weight of that empty space on the spreadsheet.
It's massive.
It really is. The table displays a massive row that simply says vacant from January 1861 all the way until June and July of 1868.
7 years.
7 years. And the electoral history column for that immense gap just reads Civil War and Reconstruction.
An entire state had absolutely zero voice in the upper chamber of the national government.
For 7 of the most turbulent years in U.S. history.
It's a profound visual representation of historical trauma. You have to remember, the Senate measures time in 2-year increments, called Congresses.
Right.
Because of this walkout, Florida missed the entirety of the 37th, 38th, and 39th Congresses, as well as a significant portion of the 40th.
Wow.
To put that into perspective for you, the state had no representation during the drafting and passing of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery.
Or the 14th Amendment.
Exactly, which guaranteed equal protection under the law.
That puts an entirely different spin on a blank row in a table. It's literally the absence of a state's voice during the most transformative legislative period in United States history.
Precisely. And they aren't readmitted to representation until Adonijah Welch and Thomas W. Osborne, both Republicans, by the way, are seated in the summer of 1868 to finish out those vacant terms.
The sheer length of that gap tells you how difficult and prolonged the process of Reconstruction truly was.
Rebuilding the political infrastructure to a point where the state could send recognized representatives back to Washington was a monumental multi-year struggle.
It really was. Now, as we move forward in the timeline, out of the Civil War era and into the late 1800s and early 1900s, the drama takes on a completely different flavor.
Oh, very different flavor.
It shifts from national fracture to severe procedural dysfunction. I was tracking the electoral history column during this era, and a recurring phrase kept catching my eye.
I know exactly the one you mean.
It pops up in 1891, again in 1897, then in 1899, and yet again in 1903. The phrase is simply, legislature failed to elect.
It's such a bureaucratic way to describe total chaos.
Right. In 1891, the seat is just vacant from March until late May. In 1897, it's empty from March to mid-May until Stephen Mallory II is finally elected.
Yeah.
How does a state government just fail to send someone to Washington?
What's fascinating here is that this specific phrase highlights a massive structural difference in how our government used to function.
Because we didn't always vote for senators directly.
Right. Today, we assume Senate elections involve citizens going to the ballot box to vote for a candidate. But this document is implicitly revealing the era before the 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913.
When state legislatures were in charge of that.
Exactly. The local politicians in Tallahassee were responsible for choosing the state's U.S. senators. And this table proves that they frequently could not get their act together to make a definitive choice.
It really reminds me of a group of friends completely failing to agree on where to go for dinner.
Yes.
Except instead of skipping a meal, they just skipped sending a representative to Washington, D.C.
That is an excellent comparison. Or like the modern gridlock we occasionally see in Congress over electing a Speaker of the House. You have deeply entrenched political factions refusing to compromise, resulting in total paralysis.
So the factions within the Florida state legislature would become so deadlocked that a sitting senator's term would simply expire.
The new Congress would officially begin in Washington on March 4th, and Florida would just leave the seat empty because the local politicians were stuck in a standoff.
But didn't they realize they were directly harming their own state's interests? If a state only has one senator for months at a time, what is the actual penalty in terms of national influence?
The penalty is severe. The United States Senate often relies on unanimous consent to move legislation forward, and every single vote carries immense weight.
So they were basically handicapping themselves.
By failing to elect a second senator, the Florida legislature was effectively cutting its own state's voting power, its committee influence, and its leverage over federal appointments squarely in half.
You can actually see the desperate band-aids they had to apply to fix this paralysis.
Yes, look at the footnotes.
In 1899, for example, the governor had to step in and temporarily appoint James Taliaferro just to get someone into the seat because the legislature had failed to act.
The governor would make a temporary appointment to stop the bleeding, and then eventually, the exhausted legislature would hold a late election to let someone officially finish the term.
It was a highly chaotic, clunky mechanism.
It really was. The repetition of legislature failed to elect serves as a stark historical receipt of intense local political gridlock.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. If the gridlock of the 1890s was a slow bureaucratic paralysis, the year 1936 was a sudden, violent upheaval.
Oh, 1936 is wild.
I was looking at the section covering the 74th Congress in 1936, and the table just turns into a total mess of temporary appointments and special elections.
It's arguably one of the most remarkable anomalies in the entire document.
What exactly happened to cause so much turnover in a single year?
It's a textbook example of how unpredictable events can completely upend a state's political power structure overnight.
Let me walk you through the dates, because the sheer volume of turnover is staggering. On May 8, 1936, Senator Park Trammell passes away.
And he had been serving since 1917, so he was a longtime fixture.
Right. A few weeks later, on May 26, the governor appoints Scott Lofton to temporarily fill Trammell's seat.
Just a placeholder.
But then, incredibly, just a couple of weeks after Lofton's appointment, Florida's other senator, Duncan U. Fletcher, passes away on June 17th.
And we really need to pause on Duncan U. Fletcher to understand the magnitude of that loss. The text explicitly notes that Fletcher was Florida's longest-serving senator,
holding office from 1909 until his death in 1936.
That is an immense amount of institutional knowledge.
So Fletcher dies in June. On July 1st, William Luther Hill is appointed to temporarily fill his seat.
Another placeholder.
Finally, on November 4th, 1936, The state holds special elections, and voters send Charles O. Andrews and Claude Pepper to Washington to finish out the respective terms.
That is 6 different men holding the title of United States Senator for Florida within a 6-month window.
It gives you political whiplash.
It does. And this raises an important question for you, the listener, about the hidden currency of the United States Senate seniority.
Right. Why does the sudden turnover of these specific seats matter so much?
In the Senate, seniority dictates committee assignments, chairmanships, and ultimately the power to direct federal resources.
And by 1936, Fletcher had 27 years of accumulated seniority.
And Trammell had 19 years.
And this is 1936. We are in the middle of the Great Depression and the rollout of the New Deal.
Exactly. Federal funding and federal projects are the lifeblood to state economies at this point. Florida had an immense amount of institutional power and negotiating leverage in Washington because of Trammell and Fletcher's decades of combined experience.
And within a span of 40 days, that power just evaporated.
The governor had to scramble to make 2 separate temporary appointments just to keep the seats warm, and then the voters completely replaced both of them in November.
So the state went from being represented by powerful veteran committee chairs to being represented by 2 freshman senators at the absolute bottom of the seniority ladder.
It is a stark reminder of the fragility of political capital.
It really is. Now, that 1936 chaos shows how quickly individual seats can turn over due to unpredictable, tragic events. But when you zoom out and look at the whole document chronologically,
The big picture.
right, you see a much slower, more massive turnover happening at the party level. And as our listeners know, we don't take sides on this show. We are strictly looking at the data presented in the source text to understand the historical trends.
And the text reveals a definitive pendulum swing in Florida's political identity over the last century.
The partisan demographic shift is impossible to ignore.
Yeah.
Following the Reconstruction era, the state delegation becomes almost exclusively Democratic.
You see this unbroken stretch through the mid to late 20th century. You have figures like Spessard Hollins serving from 1946 to 1971.
George Smathers serves alongside him.
You have Lawton Chiles serving 3 terms. Bob Graham holding his seat from 1987 to 2005.
And Bill Nelson serving from 2001 all the way to 2019. It's a highly stabilized era of Democratic dominance in these particular federal seats.
But eventually, the pendulum begins to swing in the opposite direction.
The table transitions. It introduces Republicans like Connie Mack III in the 1990s, Mel Martinez in the 2000s, and Marco Rubio elected in 2010.
And that gradual transition culminates in a major historical milestone that the authors of the Wikipedia article explicitly point out in the introductory text.
They note that following Rick Scott's election in 2018, though he officially took office in early 2019, Florida was represented by 2 Republican senators simultaneously for the first time since the Reconstruction era.
So from those post-Civil War years when Welch and Osborne were seated in 1868, it took roughly 150 years for the state's political demographics to slowly transform and return to a fully Republican Senate delegation.
It perfectly illustrates how glacial yet definitive political realignment can be at the state level.
What stands out to you when you look at this shifting tide? Because while the names and parties change, the mechanisms of appointment, election, and succession just keep grinding on.
That brings us right up to the modern era, focusing on the current landscape through 2026. And even in the present day, the timeline is throwing us some unique procedural quirks.
Machinery is always doing something interesting.
Right. For instance, the source notes that when Rick Scott was elected in 2018, his Senate term was constitutionally mandated to begin on January 3, 2019, alongside the rest of the incoming class. But the table shows a vacancy from January 3rd to January 8th. Why the delay?
The footnote provides a great piece of procedural trivia here. Scott was seated late so he could complete his term as governor of Florida before officially being sworn in as a senator.
Because he could not constitutionally hold both offices simultaneously.
Exactly. He had to finish out his gubernatorial mandate before taking his seat in the upper chamber. It is a rare but entirely legal administrative anomaly.
And we see another massive shift documented right at the end of the timeline. Marco Rubio, who had served since 2011 and had just won re-election in 2024, suddenly resigns early in his new term. What are the mechanics of that transition?
Well, the text explains that Rubio resigned to become the United States Secretary of State.
A cabinet appointment.
Right. And that created an immediate vacancy in the Senate. Consequently, Ashley Moody was appointed on January 21st, 2025, to continue Rubio's term.
But the table makes it clear that this appointment is not the end of the line.
No, it notes that the permanent successor for that Class 3 seat will be determined in a special election scheduled for 2026.
So, what does this all mean? We started today by looking at what appeared to be a standard Wikipedia list of senators from Florida.
A seemingly dry list.
But by actually unpacking the dates, reading the footnotes, and understanding the context behind the vacancies, we have mapped out an incredibly dynamic story.
We've seen a nation fracture and go to war.
We've witnessed the crippling paralysis of local legislative gridlock. We've explored the devastating impact of sudden tragedy on a state's national influence.
And tracked a 150-year demographic realignment.
It turns out there is a tremendous amount of human drama and political strategy hiding in the margins of American bureaucracy.
It really is. The continuity of government is a complex, often messy mechanism. And before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to consider.
I love a good historical mystery. What are we looking for?
It's a little structural mystery, hidden in plain sight, right at the very top of the document. In the opening paragraph, the source explicitly states, Florida was admitted to the Union on March 3, 1845, and elects its U.S. senators to Class 1 and Class 3.
Okay.
Now, if you are paying close attention to the mechanics of the Senate, you might find yourself asking, why isn't there a Class 2 senator from Florida?
That's a great question.
How does the United States Constitution actually divide these three distinct classes across all 50 states to ensure that the Senate remains a continuous body where only 1/3 of the seats are up for election during any given cycle?
It's brilliant.
It's a brilliant piece of mathematical and political engineering designed by the founders to insulate the Senate from sudden, sweeping shifts in public opinion. And it dictates exactly why Florida has the specific election years it does.
Understanding how that math works across the entire map is a fantastic rabbit hole to explore on your own.
Highly recommend it.
A little constitutional homework for the intensely curious. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this custom deep dive. Whether you are using this to prep for a meeting, expanding your historical knowledge, or you just love understanding how complex systems function, remember, there is always a fascinating story hiding right there inside the raw data.
You just had to know how to read the footnotes.
Catch you next time.